It began with a number so large that most people barely noticed it. $573 billion. Not a defense budget, not a stimulus package, not even a new infrastructure plan. This number appeared quietly in policy discussions, transportation briefings, and economic reports, buried deep within conversations about something most Americans rarely think about: railroads. But behind that number was something far more alarming than aging tracks or outdated locomotives. It was a warning. A warning that the system responsible for moving nearly 40% of all freight across the United States was approaching a breaking point. And even more shocking, the solution, according to some of the most powerful voices in Washington, might not come from the United States at all. Instead, it might come from Canada. For over a century, the American rail system has been one of the quiet engines of global power. While highways and airports grab headlines, railroads carry the real weight of the economy: grain from the Midwest, oil from North Dakota, automobiles from Detroit, containers from coastal ports, and coal from the Appalachian Basin. Every single day, more than 28,000 freight trains move across the United States. Together, they transport over 1.6 billion tons of cargo every year. It is an invisible machine, a steel network stretching over 140,000 miles of track, connecting farms, factories, mines, ports, and cities. Without it, the American economy would stall almost overnight. Supermarket shelves would empty, factories would stop production, fuel deliveries would slow, and global supply chains would fracture. But behind the appearance of stability, something dangerous has been happening. For decades, the American rail system has been aging quietly. Tracks laid generations ago are now under pressure from heavier trains. Bridges built in the early 1900s are carrying loads they were never designed to support. Signal systems and rail yards are struggling to handle the massive surge in freight demand created by modern global trade. And the cost to fix it all? Hundreds of billions of dollars. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because in recent years, analysts inside Washington and transportation agencies began noticing something unusual. While America's rail system struggled with aging infrastructure, Canada's rail network was becoming one of the most efficient freight systems in the world. Two companies, Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, had quietly built a cross-continental rail empire stretching from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. Their trains were faster, their networks were more streamlined, and their infrastructure investments were aggressive and strategic. While American rail companies focused heavily on shareholder profits and stock buybacks, Canadian rail operators invested heavily in track modernization, digital logistics systems, and international freight corridors. The result was startling. Canada, a country with 1/10 the population of the United States, had developed a rail system that many logistics experts now considered more modern and more flexible than parts of the American network. And this difference started attracting attention in Washington. Then the supply chain crises began. First came the global shipping disruption during the pandemic. Ports were overwhelmed. Containers piled up. Trucks couldn't move goods fast enough. And suddenly the rail system, long ignored, became the critical pressure valve for the entire economy. But instead of absorbing the shock, America's freight rail network began showing signs of serious strain. Rail yards backed up. Delivery times increased. Major agricultural shipments were delayed. Energy transportation slowed. Some industries even reported waiting weeks longer than expected for rail deliveries. Behind closed doors, transportation officials and logistics experts started asking a difficult question. What happens if the U.S. rail system cannot handle the next major surge in demand? Because the numbers were getting alarming. By the early 2030s, freight demand in North America is projected to increase by nearly 30%. That means hundreds of millions of additional tons of cargo every year. And expanding the current system enough to handle that demand would require $573 billion in new rail investment, tracks, bridges, terminals, rail yards, digital traffic systems, entire new freight corridors, a massive rebuilding of one of the largest transportation networks on Earth. But the United States faces a major problem. Building this system alone would take decades. This is where a controversial idea began to surface inside policy circles. Instead of rebuilding everything internally, What if the United States expanded its cross-border rail integration with Canada? What if Canadian rail companies helped carry more of America's freight? What if the two countries created a deeply integrated North American rail network? It was a proposal that sounded almost unthinkable. The world's largest economy potentially relying on its northern neighbor to help stabilize its freight infrastructure. Yet the more analysts studied the numbers, the more realistic the idea started to look. And then something happened that pushed this conversation into the global spotlight. A political figure known for aggressive economic nationalism suddenly began talking about the problem publicly. A man who had built his political career around America First policies. A man who had repeatedly pressured Canada on trade, tariffs, and manufacturing. Yet now, he was reportedly asking Canada to help solve a problem that America might not be able to fix alone. Donald Trump. The idea stunned policy experts. Could the United States, the country that built the world's most powerful transportation network, actually be approaching a moment where it needs outside help to maintain its freight system? And if Canada becomes deeply integrated into America's rail infrastructure, what would that mean for economic control, trade power, and North America's geopolitical balance? Because railroads are not just transportation. They are the arteries of national power. And when those arteries start weakening, entire economies can begin to shift. The question now being quietly asked in government offices and transportation ministries across the continent is simple, but explosive. Is the United States about to enter a new era where Canada becomes the backbone of North American freight logistics? Or is this the beginning of a much larger infrastructure crisis hiding beneath the surface of the global economy? The answer begins with a system most people never understood. A system that quietly controls how goods move across an entire continent, and why fixing it could reshape the balance of power in North America. To understand why a $573 billion demand suddenly appeared in discussions about America's railroads, you have to understand something most people never see. The rail system is not just a transportation network. It is a strategic economic machine. And for more than a century, that machine has quietly shaped the power of the United States. But the way it works, the way freight moves across a continent, is far more complex than most people imagine. In the early 20th century, the United States built the largest rail system on Earth. Steel tracks stretched across deserts, mountains, plains, and industrial corridors. Railroads connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, the Midwest to the Gulf Coast, and the agricultural heartland to the ports that fed global trade. By the mid-1900s, the American rail system had become the backbone of industrial expansion. Coal-fueled power plants, steel moved to factories, grain fed international markets, oil reached refineries. Every major sector of the economy depended on rail. But something important happened in the decades that followed. Highways and trucking began to take over. The rise of interstate highways in the 1950s dramatically changed how goods moved. Trucks offered flexibility that railroads could not. Instead of shipping cargo from one rail yard to another, trucks could deliver directly from factory to warehouse. For a while, it seemed like railroads might slowly fade into the background of the American economy. But the opposite happened. Rail did not disappear. It evolved. By the 1980s, the American freight system had split into two worlds. Trucks handled short-distance, high-speed deliveries. But rail remained unbeatable for one thing: moving enormous volumes of cargo cheaply over long distances. A single freight train can carry the equivalent of 300 to 400 trucks. That means lower fuel costs, lower emissions, and massive efficiency for bulk goods. So industries that relied on heavy shipments, agriculture, mining, energy, manufacturing, continued to depend on rail. And gradually, a small group of giant rail corporations came to dominate the system. Companies like Union Pacific, BNSF Railway, CSX Transportation, and Norfolk Southern now control most of the major freight corridors in the United States. These companies operate enormous networks. Together, they move everything from automobiles and chemicals to lumber and consumer goods. But the system they operate has a critical weakness. Unlike highways, which are funded heavily by government spending, America's freight rail infrastructure is mostly owned by private companies. And that changes everything. Private rail companies must balance two competing pressures. They need to invest billions to maintain tracks, bridges, signals, and terminals. But they are also expected to generate strong profits for investors. Over the past 2 decades, many rail companies embraced a strategy known as precision scheduled railroading. On paper, it sounded efficient. Trains became longer, rail yards were consolidated, operations were streamlined, and companies reduced labor and equipment costs. The result was impressive, at least financially. Rail companies became some of the most profitable transportation businesses in the world. But the system became leaner, tighter, and less flexible. Rail networks that once had spare capacity were now running close to maximum efficiency, which meant something important disappeared: buffer capacity. The margin of safety that allows a system to absorb unexpected shocks. For years, this vulnerability remained invisible. Freight demand was stable, global trade moved predictably, and the rail system continued to function. But then global supply chains began to change. E-commerce exploded, manufacturing shifted, energy markets fluctuated, and North America started moving larger volumes of goods across longer distances. Suddenly, the rail system was under pressure it had not faced before, and that pressure revealed another hidden problem. America's rail network was never designed for the modern era of continental logistics. Because today, freight doesn't just move within countries. It moves across borders, across oceans, across entire economic regions. And this is where Canada enters the story. While American rail companies focused on maximizing efficiency inside their own networks, Canada was thinking about something bigger. Canadian rail operators began building a continental logistics strategy. Two companies in particular played a crucial role: Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City. Instead of limiting themselves to national routes, they built rail corridors that stretched across North America. Canadian National developed a network connecting the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, Canadian Pacific expanded southward, eventually merging operations that linked Canada, the United States, and Mexico into a single freight corridor. This was a massive strategic move, because it meant Canadian rail companies were not just operating trains. They were controlling international trade pathways, grain shipments, energy exports, automotive supply chains, container traffic from Asian ports. All of it could move through Canadian rail infrastructure. And as global trade became more interconnected, this cross-border capability became incredibly valuable. Meanwhile, parts of the American rail system were showing their age. Some rail bridges are more than 100 years old. Many freight corridors were designed decades before modern container shipping existed. Rail yards built in the industrial era were now struggling to handle the surge of global freight traffic. Upgrading all of it would require enormous capital investment. But because the system is privately owned, large-scale modernization requires complex negotiations between companies, regulators, and governments, which slows everything down. And while those negotiations continued, demand kept rising. Ports expanded, e-commerce warehouses multiplied, energy exports increased, and the pressure on North American freight infrastructure grew year after year. Transportation analysts eventually realized something extraordinary. The rail systems of the United States and Canada were already deeply interconnected. Freight trains crossed the border thousands of times every week. Agricultural shipments moved between the prairie provinces and the American Midwest. Automobile parts flow between Canadian factories and American assembly plants. Energy resources travel south. Manufactured goods travel north. North America, in many ways, already operates as a shared logistics ecosystem. But until recently, no one seriously considered what would happen if the United States needed significant help expanding its rail capacity. That possibility now hangs over policy discussions. Because the $573 billion investment gap is not just a financial challenge. It is a strategic question. Who will build the next generation of North American freight infrastructure? Will the United States rebuild its rail system internally? Will private companies shoulder the cost? Or will deeper integration with Canadian rail networks become the fastest and most efficient solution? What began as a quiet infrastructure debate is now evolving into something far larger. Because if the American rail system cannot expand fast enough, the consequences will not stay confined to transportation. They will ripple across industries, energy markets, food supply chains, manufacturing hubs, and global trade routes. The stress building inside the system is real, and the first signs of that stress have already begun to appear. The moment the cracks started showing, the consequences moved faster than anyone expected. And once the system began to buckle, the crisis spread across the entire economy. For decades, the American freight rail system operated with an assumption so deeply embedded that few policymakers ever questioned it. The system would always work. No matter the demand, no matter the economic cycle, trains would keep moving. Grain would reach ports. Factories would receive materials. Energy would reach power plants. Containers would flow inland from coastal ports. It was an invisible guarantee that held the modern economy together. But systems that operate quietly for decades often hide their weaknesses until one moment reveals everything. And for America's rail network, those moments began arriving one after another. The first warning signs appeared during the global supply chain disruption triggered by the pandemic. Ports from Los Angeles to New York became clogged with container ships waiting offshore. Millions of containers piled up on docks. Truck drivers were overwhelmed. Warehouses were full. Suddenly, the entire logistics system began leaning heavily on one form of transportation that could move massive volumes quickly across long distances: rail. Freight trains became the pressure valve for a system under extreme stress. But the rail network was already operating near its limits. And as demand surged, cracks began to appear. Rail yards filled faster than they could clear. Containers sat waiting for locomotives and crews. Agricultural shipments were delayed. Coal deliveries to power plants slowed. Factories reported missing components stuck somewhere inside the rail system. The network had become so optimized, so tightly managed for efficiency, that it had lost the flexibility needed to absorb shocks. It was like an engine running perfectly at maximum speed. The moment something disrupted the rhythm, the entire machine began to shake. At the same time, freight demand across North America was entering a new era. The explosion of e-commerce changed how goods moved. Instead of predictable seasonal shipments, companies now required constant, high-volume logistics. Massive distribution centers appeared across the continent. Each one needed continuous flows of products. Meanwhile, energy markets were shifting. American oil exports surged. Liquefied natural gas shipments expanded. Agricultural production reached record levels. Every one of these sectors relied heavily on rail, and every one of them was demanding more capacity. Transportation economists began modeling the future. The results were alarming. By the early 2030s, North American freight demand could increase by nearly 30%. That meant hundreds of millions of additional tons of cargo moving every year. To support that growth, the United States would need to upgrade thousands of miles of track, expand major rail yards, replace aging bridges, modernize signaling systems, and build entirely new freight corridors. The cost estimate stunned policymakers: $573 billion. A number so large that it immediately raised another question: who would actually pay for it? In theory, private rail companies could fund the upgrades. But investors expect profits, not decades-long infrastructure rebuilds. Government funding could help, but large federal infrastructure programs face political battles and long timelines. And even if the money were approved tomorrow, constructing a rail network of that scale could take 20 to 30 years. But freight demand was rising now, which meant policymakers began looking for something faster. And that search led them north. Canada's rail system had quietly become one of the most efficient freight networks in the world. While the United States debated modernization, Canadian rail companies invested aggressively in infrastructure, automation, and long-distance freight corridors. Two companies in particular reshaped the logistics map of North America: Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City. Their networks stretched across thousands of miles, connecting three coasts and linking the economies of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. More importantly, they had capacity. Their routes were designed to handle international freight flows. Their infrastructure was modernized. Their cross-border logistics systems were already integrated with American supply chains, which meant something extraordinary was possible. If the United States expanded cooperation with Canadian rail operators, freight could move through new continental corridors. Goods from American factories could travel through Canadian routes to reach ports faster. Energy exports could move north before reaching international markets. Agricultural shipments could flow through integrated rail networks spanning the entire continent. In other words, Canada could become a critical extension of America's freight capacity. And this is where the political drama began. Because infrastructure is never just about engineering. It is about power. Railroads control the movement of goods, and the movement of goods controls the movement of wealth. For decades, the United States dominated global logistics through its ports, highways, and rail corridors. But deeper integration with Canadian rail systems would subtly shift that balance. North America would begin operating not as separate national networks, but as a continental freight system. And that raised serious questions. Who controls the routes? Who sets the prices? Who decides which industries receive priority during shortages? These questions became even more explosive when political leaders started discussing the issue publicly. Among them was Donald Trump, whose economic policies had long emphasized national independence and domestic industry. Yet even within those political circles, analysts acknowledged a difficult reality. The United States could rebuild its rail infrastructure alone, but it would take enormous time, enormous money, and enormous political will. And in a world where global trade moves faster every year, waiting decades may not be an option. So the conversation shifted. Instead of choosing between national systems, policymakers began discussing something bigger, a North American logistics strategy, one where American railroads, Canadian freight corridors, and Mexican manufacturing routes operate together as a unified economic engine. If it works, it could create one of the most powerful transportation networks on Earth. A system capable of moving goods across an entire continent faster and cheaper than any competitor. But if it fails, if investment stalls, if infrastructure continues aging while demand keeps rising, then the consequences could be severe. Supply chains would tighten, transportation costs would climb, energy exports could slow, food shipments could face delays, and the invisible machine that keeps the modern economy running would begin grinding against its limits. Because in the end, railroads are more than steel tracks and locomotives. They are the arteries of civilization. Every train that crosses a continent carries the raw materials of modern life: food, fuel, machines, technology. And when those arteries become strained, the entire body of the economy feels it. The $573 billion question facing North America today is not simply about infrastructure. It is about how the next era of continental power will be built. Will the United States rebuild its rail system and maintain complete control of its freight future? Or will North America move toward a deeply integrated transportation network where borders matter less than efficiency? The answer will shape the next generation of trade, industry, and geopolitical influence. And it will determine whether the steel tracks that built modern America remain strong enough to carry the weight of the future.